Atlas knew before the engine failed. He knew before Caleb Rowe turned the key, before the porch light flickered against the frost, before the first pale line of morning touched the windshield of the old blue truck. Every night, while the rest of Briar Falls slept under quilts and quiet prayers, the German Shepherd lay beside the front tire like a soldier posted at the last gate of a forgotten war. He did not sleep deeply. He never had. His ears moved with the wind. His nose read the cold air. His amber eyes opened at the smallest shift in Caleb's breathing behind the thin walls of the little house at the edge of town. People had noticed, of course. Mrs. Bell from across the road called it sweet. The mailman called it stubborn. The kids on their bikes called Atlas the truck dog, laughing as they coasted past the gravel drive. But Caleb never laughed. Not about that. He had bought Atlas a padded bed by the fireplace, a thick blanket from the feed store, even a soft rug near the kitchen where the winter heat rose clean and steady through the floorboards. Still, every night, after Caleb turned off the lamp and the house settled into darkness, Atlas would rise without a sound, nose the back door open if it had not latched, and walk out to the truck. Same place, same tire, same quiet watch beneath the stars. Caleb Rowe was 37, a white former United States Marine with close-cropped brown hair, tired blue eyes, and hands that still moved like they remembered orders his mouth no longer gave. He lived alone now, fixing fences, hauling lumber, changing oil for neighbors who paid in cash, pie, or sometimes just gratitude. The truck was a 1998 Ford, faded blue, rust-kissed along the wheel wells, with a cracked dashboard and a bench seat worn smooth by years of use. It had carried Caleb home when he left the Corps. It had carried him through storms, through sleepless nights, through miles of back roads when memory got too loud inside the house. To most people, it was just an old machine. To Caleb, it was proof that something broken could still start if you gave it enough patience. That morning, the air was sharp enough to sting. 28 degrees, maybe colder. Frost silvered the hood, the fence rails, the tall weeds along the ditch. Caleb stepped onto the porch in his work jacket, coffee steaming in one hand, keys hooked around one finger. He saw Atlas already standing. Not stretching, not wagging. Standing. The dog's body was rigid, his dark sable coat lifted slightly along the spine, his gaze fixed on the truck door. Caleb slowed. "Morning, boy," he said, voice rough from sleep. Atlas did not move. Caleb crossed the yard, boots crunching over frozen gravel. He opened the driver's door, set his coffee in the cup holder, and slid behind the wheel. The cab smelled like old vinyl, dust, cold metal, and faintly of cedar from the toolbox in back. A dog tag swung from the mirror, tapping once against the glass. Caleb put the key in. Atlas stepped forward. Caleb turned it. Nothing. No cough. No grind. No tired rumble fighting its way awake. Just silence. A silence too complete. Caleb frowned and tried again. This time the dashboard lights blinked weakly, then faded. Outside, Atlas gave one low sound from deep in his chest. Not a bark. A warning. Caleb looked through the windshield and found the shepherd staring straight at him, eyes bright in the gray dawn. "It's just the battery," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He reached for the key again, but Atlas moved fast, planting both front paws on the running board, blocking the open door with his body. Caleb froze. The dog's breath drifted white between them. His ears were forward, his nose angled toward the hood. And in that moment, with his hand still resting on the key, Caleb felt something he had not felt in years. Not fear. Recognition. Because Atlas had looked at him that way once before. Not in Briar Falls. Not beside a quiet house. Somewhere far from home, beneath a sky full of heat and dust, when the difference between going forward and staying alive had been measured in seconds. Caleb did not turn the key again. His fingers stayed on the cold metal for a moment, then slowly let go. Outside the open door, Atlas remained still, front paws braced on the running board, chest rising and falling in short white clouds. The dog was not trying to be disobedient. Caleb knew that now. There was a difference between a stubborn animal and a trained soul trying to speak without words. The yard around them held its breath. Frost clung to the grass. The small house behind him looked gentle in the dawn, its windows glowing pale gold, its chimney sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray sky. Somewhere down the road, a pickup passed without slowing, tires whispering over the frozen pavement. Ordinary morning. Ordinary town. Ordinary silence. But Caleb had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a smell too faint to name, a wire too warm to touch, a pause in the rhythm of things that should have kept moving. He eased one boot onto the gravel and stepped out of the cab. Atlas backed down only when Caleb was fully clear of the seat. Then the shepherd turned his head toward the hood and gave a low, restless whine. Caleb stood beside him, one hand resting on the open door. "All right," he said softly. "Show me." Atlas did not run. He moved with purpose, nose close to the seam where the hood met the grill, then along the front bumper, then back toward the driver's side where he had slept through the night. Caleb followed, breath steady but shallow. Up close, he caught it. Not smoke. Not gasoline exactly. Something sharper. Heated plastic. Old insulation. The kind of scent that did not belong in cold morning air. His jaw tightened. He reached under the dash for the hood release and pulled. The latch gave a dull pop that sounded louder than it should have. Atlas flinched, then pressed against Caleb's leg as if anchoring him there. Caleb lifted the hood. A thin breath of trapped air rose from the engine bay, carrying that same bitter smell. The battery cables sat stiff with frost. A section of wiring near the starter looked darker than the rest, not obvious at first glance, but wrong enough to make Caleb's stomach sink. He leaned closer, then stopped when Atlas nudged his knee with sudden force. Caleb looked down. The dog's eyes were locked on the lower engine block. Caleb reached for the flashlight clipped inside his coat pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the gray morning and found a small wet shine beneath the metal, just enough to catch the light. Caleb did not move for several seconds. He had fixed engines since he was 16. He knew what a leak looked like. He knew what a bad wire could do when paired with one more careless turn of a key. He stepped back, slow and deliberate. Atlas stepped with him. The old truck sat silent, harmless looking, frost still bright on the hood. But Caleb felt the truth settle over him with a cold weight. Atlas had not been guarding the truck from the world. He had been guarding Caleb from the truck. For a moment, all Caleb could hear was the dog breathing beside him and the faint clink of the dog tags swinging inside the cab. That sound pulled at something buried deep. He turned toward it. Through the open door, the tag moved gently on its chain beneath the rearview mirror, catching the weak morning light. It was not Caleb's current tag. That one stayed in a drawer he almost never opened. This tag was older, duller, worn thin along one edge. He had left it there years ago and taught himself not to look at it. Caleb reached inside and closed his fingers around it. The metal was ice cold. The name stamped across it struck him the way it always did, quietly and all at once. Mason Reed. Caleb's throat tightened. Atlas lowered his head and gave a sound so soft it was almost a sigh. There had been a time when Mason's laugh filled the cab of every vehicle they rode in, when Caleb was younger, louder, easier to reach. Mason had been the one who taught him to trust Atlas not just as a dog, not just as a working partner, but as a living compass. "He hears what we miss," Mason used to say. "If he waits, you listen." Caleb had heard those words 100 times. Then life had taken him home with only half his heart, and somewhere between grief, work, and the quiet shame of surviving, he had stopped listening to almost everything. He looked down at Atlas now. The shepherd stood with frost on his whiskers and dawn in his eyes, older than he had been back then, but carrying the same promise. Caleb closed his hand around Mason's tag, then knelt slowly on the gravel. His knees complained. The cold bit through his jeans. Atlas stepped into him at once, pressing his broad head against Caleb's chest. Caleb held him there, one hand buried in the thick fur behind his ears, the other gripping the old tag like it was a message returned from a place no truck could ever drive back to. "You remembered," Caleb whispered. His voice barely made it into the morning air. Atlas did not answer. He only stayed. Caleb stayed on the frozen gravel longer than he meant to. The cold worked through the denim at his knees, but he barely felt it. Atlas stood pressed against him, steady as a post in high wind, breathing warm against the front of Caleb's jacket. The dog tag rested in Caleb's palm, its worn edges biting gently into his skin. Mason Reed. Some names did not fade with time. They only learned to live quietly under everything else. Caleb closed his eyes, and the morning in Briar Falls thinned away. For one breath, he was back years earlier, inside a military vehicle that smelled of dust, canvas, sun-baked metal, and black coffee gone cold in a paper cup. Mason sat beside him then, boots on the floorboard, one hand loose near Atlas's harness, talking the way he always talked when silence got too heavy. Not loud, just enough to keep the world human. Caleb remembered the heat shimmering beyond the windshield, the dry wind nudging sand across the road, the radio murmuring in short, clipped voices. Atlas had been younger then, all muscle and nerve, ears sharp, eyes always reading what men tried to hide. Caleb had trusted maps. Mason had trusted people. Atlas had trusted the air. That was why Mason noticed first when the shepherd stopped moving. Not sat, not lay down. Stopped. Every line of him went still. His nose lifted toward the vents. His ears angled forward. Caleb had reached for the ignition, impatient, tired, ready to move, and Mason had put a hand on his wrist. Wait, he said. Caleb almost laughed, because Marines were trained to move, not wait. But Mason's face had changed. His easy grin was gone. He was watching Atlas. If he waits, you listen. Caleb remembered those words now with painful clarity, remembered Mason's hand warm over his, remembered the way Atlas gave one low breath and backed away from the dashboard. They had stepped out. They had checked. A small fault, almost invisible, had been hiding where no one would have looked until it was too late to matter. Caleb never forgot the lesson, or he thought he never had. The truth was worse. He had remembered it in war, then forgotten it in peace. That was the part that hurt. He opened his eyes. The old blue Ford sat in front of him, harmless in the frost, hood still raised like a question. Morning had brightened. A crow called once from the fence line. Down the road, somebody started a tractor. Life kept moving, rude and faithful. Caleb rose slowly, slipping Mason's tag into the pocket of his work jacket. Atlas looked up at him, waiting. "We are not driving this thing today," Caleb said. The words came out rough, but calm. Atlas's tail moved once, low and careful. Caleb took his phone from his pocket and called Earl Bennett, the only mechanic in town who still answered before 7. Earl arrived 20 minutes later in a white tow truck that had more dents than paint and a thermos balanced on the dashboard. He was in his 60s, with silver hair tucked under a ball cap and hands darkened from a lifetime of engines. He climbed out, took one look at Caleb, then at Atlas, then at the open hood. "That dog looks like he filed the complaint himself," Earl said. Caleb did not smile, not quite. He might have. Earl leaned in with a flashlight, muttering to himself. The morning warmed by a few degrees, but the air still smelled of frost and pine smoke. Atlas stayed beside Caleb the whole time, never crowding Earl, never taking his eyes off the truck for long. After several minutes, Earl straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and exhaled through his nose. "You tried starting it more than once." "Twice," Caleb said. Earl looked at him then, the humor gone from his face. "Good thing you stopped." The sentence landed quietly. No drama, no thunder, just truth. Caleb glanced down at Atlas. The shepherd stood in the pale sunlight, frost melting along his whiskers, steady and silent, as if he had done nothing extraordinary at all. Earl tapped the edge of the engine bay with his knuckles. "Wiring is chewed up or worn through near the starter, and you have a small fuel leak. Could have gotten real ugly if it caught right." Caleb swallowed. The world seemed to narrow to the gravel under his boots, the tag in his pocket, the dog at his side. Earl kept talking about parts, labor, towing it to the shop, maybe 2 days if the supplier in Spokane had what they needed. Caleb nodded, but most of his attention had moved elsewhere, to the patch of ground beside the front tire. The grass there was flattened in the shape of Atlas's body. Night after night, through frost, rain, and summer dust, the dog had chosen that place. Not because of the truck, because of the man who kept trying to leave himself behind in it. When Earl hooked the Ford to the tow line, Atlas stepped forward, uneasy. Caleb crouched and placed a hand against his chest. "Let it go," he whispered. Atlas looked from the truck to Caleb. For a moment, the old fear returned to those amber eyes, the fear of a promise being taken away. Caleb touched the pocket where Mason's tag rested. "I heard you this time." Atlas leaned into him, and when the tow truck pulled the Ford slowly down the drive, the shepherd did not chase it. He stayed beside Caleb, watching until the blue tailgate disappeared beyond the bend, and the empty space it left behind filled with morning light. After the tow truck disappeared, the yard felt larger than it had in years. The patch of empty gravel where the Ford had always sat looked almost wrong, like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. Caleb stood there with Atlas beside him, one hand tucked into his jacket pocket around Mason Reed's dog tag, the other hanging loose at his side. He had expected relief. The dangerous part was gone. Earl had taken the truck. The house still stood warm behind him. The day had not broken open the way it might have. But instead of relief, Caleb felt a strange, hollow, quiet move through his chest. Atlas sensed it. He always did. The shepherd stepped closer and nudged Caleb's hand with his nose, not demanding, only reminding. Caleb looked down at him. "I know," he said. But he did not know. Not yet. Without the truck in the drive, there was nowhere for Atlas to take his post. Without the post, there was no ritual for Caleb to pretend was only a dog's habit. The truth had room now. Too much room. He went inside, and Atlas followed as far as the back door, then stopped on the threshold. Caleb turned. The shepherd stood with his front paws just inside the kitchen, his back paws still on the porch boards, caught between the warmth of the house and the place outside where his duty had always been. Caleb almost told him to come in. The words rose, then failed. He took off his work jacket instead and hung it on the chair. The dog tag in the pocket tapped softly against the wood. That tiny sound filled the room. The kitchen was plain, clean, and too quiet. A white mug sat by the sink. A half-read newspaper lay folded on the table. The old wall clock clicked with an honesty Caleb had always disliked. He opened the jacket pocket and placed Mason's tag on the table. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Atlas came closer then, slow and careful, nails clicking against the floorboards. He lowered his head, sniffed the tag once, and sat. Caleb pulled out the chair and lowered himself into it. The morning sun came through the window in pale strips, touching the metal until the stamped letters shone. Mason Reed. Caleb had carried the memory for years, but memory was not the same as honor. Memory could become a locked room. Honor required opening the door. He reached into the drawer beneath the table, the one he rarely used, and found a small envelope of photographs. The paper had yellowed along the edges. His fingers hesitated before he opened it. The first photo showed 3 young Marines standing beside a vehicle under a wide, hard sky. Caleb was there, younger and leaner, his white skin browned by sun, his grin awkward but real. Mason stood beside him with one arm raised mid-gesture, caught in the middle of saying something that had probably made everyone groan. And at their boots sat Atlas, younger then, ears too big for his head, chest proud, eyes fixed not on the camera, but on Caleb. The sight took the air out of him. Caleb let the photograph rest on the table. Atlas leaned forward and touched the corner of it with his nose. "That was before I got quiet," Caleb murmured. His voice sounded unfamiliar in the kitchen. He could almost hear Mason answering, not as a ghost, not as anything grand, just as memory with its sleeves rolled up. "You were never quiet. You were just waiting for somebody patient enough to hear you." Caleb closed his eyes, but no tears came yet. That was the mercy and the cruelty of it. Some grief did not fall. It sat. It stayed. It made a home in the ribs. Outside, a school bus rolled by, brakes sighing at the corner. A dog barked somewhere far down the road. Briar Falls continued with its small American morning. Mailboxes, frost, engines starting, coffee brewing. People stepping into ordinary lives without knowing one man had just been handed back a piece of his soul. Caleb opened his eyes and looked at Atlas. "You have been waiting on me this whole time," he said. Atlas tilted his head, the way he did when words mattered even if he did not understand every one. Caleb pushed back from the table, stood, and walked to the living room. Near the fireplace was the padded bed Atlas had never used for more than a polite minute. Caleb picked it up, carried it to the kitchen, then stopped. No, that was still him choosing the place. He looked at the shepherd. "Where do you want it?" Atlas watched him, uncertain. Caleb carried the bed into the living room and set it near his old armchair, the one facing the window that looked out over the empty drive. Then he took Mason's photograph and dog tag and placed them on the small side table beneath the lamp. Not hidden, not tucked away. Seen. Atlas walked in slowly. He sniffed the bed, circled once, then looked toward the back door. The habit was still pulling at him. Caleb sat in the chair, leaned forward, and rested both hands on his knees. "You do not have to guard the truck today," he said, the words rough but steady. "You can guard me from here." Atlas stood still for 3 breaths. Then, with the careful trust of a creature laying down a burden, He stepped onto the bed and lowered himself beside Caleb's boots. By noon, the sun had burned the frost off the grass, and the empty driveway shone with wet patches where the truck had been. Caleb sat in the old armchair with Atlas asleep beside his boots, one heavy paw resting over the edge of the padded bed. The house sounded different with the dog inside. Not louder, fuller. The soft rise and fall of Atlas's breathing moved through the room like a small promise being kept. Caleb had tried to make coffee twice and forgotten both cups on the counter. He had opened the newspaper and read the same headline 4 times without understanding a word. His eyes kept returning to the side table, where Mason's dog tag lay beside the photograph. Seen. That was the part that made his chest ache. For years, Caleb had hidden every piece of the past in drawers, glove compartments, toolboxes, and quiet corners of himself. He told people he was fine because fine was short and did not invite questions. He worked because work had edges. He fixed engines because engines either started or they did not. Grief was not like that. Grief could sound perfectly normal. It could wear a clean jacket, pay bills on time, wave to neighbors, and still sleep every night beside a closed door inside the heart. Atlas opened his eyes before Caleb heard the knock. The shepherd lifted his head, ears forward, but did not rise in alarm. A second later, someone tapped gently on the front door. Caleb stood, joints stiff from sitting too long, and crossed the room. Mrs. Bell stood on the porch holding a covered dish wrapped in a blue towel. She was 72, small, silver-haired, and sharp-eyed in the way of women who had watched a whole town grow up and make the same mistakes twice. "I saw Earl haul the Ford away," she said. Figured that either meant trouble or expensive trouble. Caleb looked at the dish. "You did not have to. Nobody ever has to bring chicken pot pie, Caleb. That is what makes it decent." He almost smiled and stepped aside. Atlas remained by the chair, watching calmly. Mrs. Bell noticed the dog bed near Caleb's boots, then noticed the photograph on the table. Her expression softened, but she did not reach for it. That was one of her gifts. She knew when not to touch. Atlas finally came in, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Truck is gone." Maybe that was not the only reason. Caleb looked toward the window. Outside, the yard was bright and ordinary, but the gravel seemed too open, too honest. Mrs. Bell carried the dish to the kitchen and set it on the stove. "Your friend in the picture," she said after a moment. "Mason," Caleb answered. The name did not break him. That surprised him. It hurt, but it stood. Mrs. Bell folded the towel with slow care. "I remember when you came back to town. You had that truck, that dog, and eyes like a man listening for something behind him." Caleb said nothing. Atlas rose then and walked to him, pressing his shoulder against Caleb's leg. Mrs. Bell watched the gesture, and her voice lowered. "Some dogs are not pets. They are witnesses." The words entered the room and stayed there. Caleb looked down at Atlas. Witness? Yes. Atlas had witnessed the parts Caleb had locked away. The restless drives after midnight. The mornings when Caleb sat in the truck before sunrise without turning the key. The nights he stood in the garage with one hand on the hood, as if touching an altar to a life he could not return to. Atlas had witnessed all of it and never asked him to explain. He had only stayed close enough to bring him back. Mrs. Bell left the pot pie on the stove and went home without making him promise anything. That was another mercy. After she was gone, Caleb took the photograph from the table and carried it to the small bookshelf in the hallway. For years, the shelf had held only manuals, bills, a flashlight, and a jar of spare screws. He cleared a space at eye level, set the picture there, then hung Mason's dog tag over the corner of the frame. The metal caught the afternoon light. Atlas sat beside him and looked up, as if approving the placement. Caleb stood there for a long time. "He told me to listen to you," Caleb said. His voice was low, steady enough now to be true. Atlas leaned his head against Caleb's thigh. Outside, a breeze moved through the bare branches near the porch. The empty drive no longer looked like something missing. It looked like space made ready for something honest to arrive. Late afternoon settled over Briar Falls with the color of watered honey. The kind of light that made old barns look gentle and bare trees look less lonely. Caleb stood in the hallway with Atlas at his side, both of them facing the photograph now resting on the shelf. Mason's dog tag hung over the corner of the frame, still and bright. Nothing in the house had changed much. The floorboards still creaked near the kitchen. The clock still clicked with stubborn patience. The wind still found its way under the back door. and yet the whole place felt as if someone had opened a window inside it. Caleb touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers. Not long, just enough. Then he reached for his jacket. Atlas rose at once. "Easy," Caleb said. "We are walking." Outside, the empty driveway waited under the cooling sky. For the first time in years, Caleb did not cross it toward the truck. He walked past the space where it had been, down the gravel drive, and onto the narrow county road that curved toward town. Atlas stayed at his left knee, steady and alert, the way he had been trained, but softer now. Not on duty. Not exactly. The air smelled of damp leaves, distant chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of hay from the Miller place half a mile over. A few pickup trucks passed, drivers lifting 2 fingers from the wheel in the quiet greeting of small towns. Caleb lifted his hand back. That small motion felt heavier than it should have. They walked until the road met the old covered bridge near Willow Creek, where the water moved slow and brown beneath the boards. Caleb had not come here in months. Maybe longer. This was where he used to stop on nights when the house felt too tight, and the truck carried him nowhere in particular. He would park near the bridge, leave the engine running, and sit with both hands on the wheel while Atlas watched him from the passenger seat. The dog had never whined then, never begged. He had only waited. Caleb stepped onto the bridge now, boots thudding softly against the worn planks. Atlas paused at the entrance, sniffing the air. Then he followed. In the middle, Caleb stopped and looked through the open side slats toward the creek. The late sun turned the water copper. Fallen leaves drifted past, circling once around a stone before letting go. Caleb leaned his forearms on the rail. For years, he had believed moving forward meant leaving Mason behind. So he had done neither. He had stayed parked in the same invisible place, engine idling, heart locked, dog waiting. Atlas sat beside him, shoulder against his leg. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out nothing. The tag was home now. The photograph was home. The old promise was no longer trapped in his jacket, like contraband from another life. "I thought if I stopped hurting, it meant I forgot him," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, nearly taken by the creek. Atlas turned his head toward him. "But you never forgot. You just kept watch." The shepherd's ears shifted at the sound of his name not being spoken, yet somehow being understood. Caleb breathed in through his nose, slow and careful, filling his lungs with cold, clean air. It did not fix everything. Healing did not arrive that way. It came like dusk, inch by inch, changing the shape of what had already been there. On the walk back, the first porch lights had begun to glow across Briar Falls. Mrs. Bell waved from her window. Somewhere, a child laughed in a yard. Earl's tow truck rumbled past in the distance, heading toward the shop with its beacon off and the old Ford behind it. Atlas stopped when he saw the truck. His body tightened for one heartbeat. Caleb felt it. He placed his hand lightly between the dog's shoulders. "Not tonight," he said. Atlas looked up at him, then back at the Ford as it rolled away toward town. This time, the shepherd did not step after it. He chose Caleb. They reached the house just as the sky turned deep blue. Caleb opened the front door instead of the back. Warm air spilled out, carrying the smell of chicken pot pie from the kitchen and wood smoke from the fireplace. Atlas stood on the porch, looking past Caleb into the living room, then over his shoulder toward the empty driveway. The old pull of duty still lived in him. Caleb understood that kind of pull. He had lived with it too. So he did not command. He waited. After a long moment, Atlas crossed the threshold. Caleb shut the door gently behind them, and the sound was softer than any ending he had feared. Night gathered slowly around the little house at the edge of Briar Falls. It did not fall all at once. It seeped into the corners, softened the windows, turned the empty driveway into a dark square of gravel beneath the porch light. Caleb ate at the kitchen table for the first time in weeks without standing over the sink or carrying his plate to the garage. Mrs. Bell's chicken pot pie steamed in a white bowl, rich with pepper and carrots, and the smell filled the house with the kind of comfort that did not ask permission. Atlas lay in the living room on the padded bed near the old armchair, but his eyes never fully closed. Every few minutes, he lifted his head and looked toward the front window. Caleb noticed each time. He knew that look. Duty did not vanish because a door had closed. It had to be taught that peace was allowed. After dinner, Caleb washed the bowl, dried it, and left it in the rack. A simple act. A finished act. Then he walked into the living room and sat in the chair beside Atlas. The fire had settled low, glowing orange beneath gray ash. On the shelf in the hallway, Mason's photograph caught a thin line of lamplight. Caleb could see it from where he sat. 3 figures preserved in a better hour. 2 men, 1 dog. A promise none of them had understood fully when it was made. Atlas raised his head as Caleb leaned forward. "You want to check?" Caleb said softly. The shepherd blinked, still watching him. Caleb stood, took his jacket from the hook, and opened the front door. Cold air entered at once, clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine smoke, damp soil, and distant road dust. Atlas rose quickly, but Caleb did not step outside. He stood in the doorway and waited. The empty driveway stretched ahead. The patch beside the missing front tire looked darker than the rest, flattened from all the nights Atlas had kept watch there. Caleb looked down at the dog. "Go on," he whispered. Atlas stepped onto the porch, then down to the gravel. He walked to the place where the truck had been and lowered his nose to the ground. Caleb followed only as far as the porch steps. He did not call him back. He did not command him forward. The shepherd circled the old spot once, then twice. His paws made soft sounds over the stone. He stopped where the front wheel used to rest, sniffed the frozen earth, and stood still under the porch light. For a moment, Caleb saw him as he had been for years, alone in the cold, body curved against a machine, keeping guard over a man who did not know he was lost. Caleb's chest tightened. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out barely louder than the wind. Atlas turned his head. Caleb stepped down then, slowly, boots crunching over gravel, until he stood beside him in the empty drive. "I thought I was taking care of you," Caleb said. "But you were carrying the watch I never relieved you from." Atlas looked up at him, amber eyes reflecting the porch light. The dog did not need an apology, not the way people did. He did not keep score. He only knew closeness, absence, scent, tone, the difference between a closed heart and an open hand. Caleb crouched, ignoring the cold bite in his knees, and held out both hands. Atlas came to him without hesitation. Caleb wrapped his arms around the shepherd's thick neck and pressed his face into the warm fur. For the first time, the tears came. Quietly. No sound but one broken breath leaving him after years of being held too tightly inside. Atlas stood still and let him grieve. Not for the truck, not only for Mason. For the younger man in the photograph, for the years spent pretending survival was the same as living. For every night this loyal creature had slept under stars because Caleb had not known how to come home. The wind moved through the bare branches along the fence. Somewhere far off, Earl's shop bell clanged once and went silent. Caleb stayed there until his breathing eased. Then he lifted his head and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Come inside, partner," he said. This time, the word did not feel borrowed from the past. It belonged to now. Atlas looked once more at the empty spot in the driveway. Then he turned away from it. Side by side, man and dog walked back across the gravel, up the porch steps, and through the open door into the warmth waiting beyond. The next morning came without frost, but the air still carried the clean bite of early winter. Caleb woke before the alarm, not because of a dream, not because of the old pull toward the garage, but because something warm and heavy rested across his boots. Atlas was asleep on the padded bed beside the armchair, one paw stretched over Caleb's worn leatherwork boots, as if making sure they did not leave without him. For a while, Caleb did not move. Dawn gathered slowly behind the curtains, turning the room blue, then gray, then gold along the edges of the furniture. The house was quiet in a different way now. Not empty. Resting. Caleb sat up and rubbed one hand over his face. His eyes drifted to the hallway shelf where Mason's photograph stood beneath the little lamp. The dog tag still hung over the frame, no longer hidden, no longer carried like a private punishment. He walked over and turned on the lamp. Soft light touched the picture, and for the first time, Caleb looked at Mason's grin without looking away. "Morning," he said. It was not a prayer exactly. It was not a speech. Just a greeting late by several years. Atlas lifted his head at the sound, ears relaxed, eyes half awake. Caleb made coffee, fed Atlas, and opened the front door to let in the pale air. The empty driveway waited outside, but it did not accuse him now. It was only gravel. Only space. Around 9, Earl Bennett called from the shop. His voice crackled through the phone, half buried beneath the sound of tools and a radio playing old country music. "Ford is fixable," Earl said. "Not pretty, but fixable. Wiring harness, starter work, fuel line. I can get her running safe. Caleb looked through the window at Atlas, who had stepped onto the porch and was smelling the wind. Take your time, Caleb said. Earl paused, as if surprised by that. You sure? Caleb watched Atlas turn back toward the house instead of the driveway. Yes, he said. I am sure. After the call, Caleb did something he had avoided for years. He walked to the garage, opened the side door, and stepped inside without needing the truck there to give the room a purpose. Dust floated in the morning light. Tools hung on pegboard. A folded tarp lay in the corner. On the workbench sat old parts, a coffee can of bolts, and a wooden box he had not opened since moving back to Briar Falls. Atlas entered behind him, calm and curious. Caleb lifted the box lid. Inside were small pieces of a life he had treated like evidence from a place he could not revisit. A unit patch, an old compass, folded letters, a photograph of Mason sitting on a tailgate with Atlas pressed against his knee, and a spare collar tag from the first year Atlas came home with him. Caleb touched each item slowly, not to punish himself, but to remember rightly. There was a difference. The past had edges, but it also had warmth. Mason had laughed. Atlas had been young. Caleb had once believed the world could still be trusted. He picked up the spare collar tag and rubbed the dust from it with his thumb. Atlas stepped closer, nose working softly. You carried enough, Caleb said. He took the tag inside, found a small ring in the kitchen drawer, and clipped it beside Atlas's current tag. It gave a faint silver sound when Atlas moved, a little brighter than the old silence. That afternoon, Caleb drove Mrs. Bell's borrowed sedan into town to bring Earl a deposit for the repairs. Atlas rode in the back seat, uneasy at first without the familiar smell of the Ford, then settling as Caleb reached back and touched his paw at the stop sign. At Earl's shop, the blue truck sat in the open bay with its hood raised, wires exposed, parts carefully laid out on a red cloth. Earl wiped his hands and nodded toward it. She gave you warning signs for a while, he said. Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the truck. Someone did. Earl followed his gaze and gave the shepherd a respectful little salute with 2 fingers. Then I owe him a biscuit from the office. Atlas accepted the biscuit gently, with the dignity of a veteran receiving a medal he did not ask for. Caleb stood beside the Ford, one hand resting on the fender. For years, he had used this truck to outrun quiet rooms. Now, for the first time, he could imagine using it to come home. He looked down at Atlas and felt the old ache still there, but changed. Softer, honest, not gone, maybe never gone, but no longer driving. 3 days later, Earl Bennett drove the old blue Ford back to Caleb's house just before sunset. The truck came slowly up the county road, engine humming smooth and even, its headlights catching the dust in the air like tiny sparks of gold. Caleb heard it before he saw it. So did Atlas. The German shepherd rose from his bed beside the armchair and walked to the front window, ears forward, body still. Caleb stood behind him with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Neither of them moved until Earl turned into the drive and parked where the Ford had always sat. The engine idled for a moment, steady now, alive but not angry. Then Earl shut it off, climbed out, and tossed Caleb the keys. She is safe, he said. Old, but safe. Caleb caught the keys in his palm. For years, that sound had meant leaving. Work, errands, midnight drives, roads that gave him somewhere to go when his own house felt too quiet. Now the metal in his hand felt different. It felt like a choice. Earl gave Atlas a biscuit, told him he was the real mechanic, and headed back toward town in his tow truck. When the sound faded, evening settled over the yard. The sky was purple at the edges, with a thin line of orange behind the bare trees. Caleb walked to the Ford and opened the driver's door. The cab smelled faintly of new wiring, clean rubber, old vinyl, and the cedar toolbox in back. Mason's dog tag no longer hung from the mirror. Caleb had left it inside, on the shelf, where it belonged among the living things of the house. He sat behind the wheel, but he did not turn the key. Atlas stood outside the open door, watching him. Caleb looked at the passenger seat, then patted it once. Come on, partner. Atlas climbed in, slower than he used to, but with the same quiet dignity. He sat beside Caleb, facing forward, his new tag giving a soft chime against the old one on his collar. Caleb turned the key. The engine started at once, a low, clean rumble. Atlas did not flinch. Caleb smiled, just barely. They drove only 2 miles that evening, down past Mrs. Bell's house, over the covered bridge, and up to the ridge where the whole town could be seen glowing beneath the early stars. Caleb parked there and rolled the window down. Cold air entered the cab, carrying the smell of pine, wood smoke, and distant rain. For a long while, he and Atlas simply sat. No running, no hiding, just sitting inside a machine that no longer held the power to take him away from himself. Caleb reached across the seat and rested his hand on Atlas's neck. Beneath the thick fur, the dog's pulse was steady. "We are going home," Caleb said. And for once, the words did not sound like a place on a map. Back at the house, he parked the truck in the drive, but he did not leave Atlas outside with it. He opened the front door, turned on the lamp by Mason's photograph, and waited. Atlas stood on the porch for a moment, looking from the truck to Caleb, from old duty to new peace. Then he stepped inside. That night, the blue Ford cooled quietly under the stars, alone for the first time in years. Inside, Caleb sat in the armchair with one hand resting over Atlas's back as the shepherd slept beside his boots. The fire softened. The clock clicked. The house breathed. And in the small, warm silence, Caleb understood what mercy had looked like all along. Not thunder. Not a sign written across the sky. Just a loyal dog refusing to leave the cold until the man he loved finally came home.